change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of John. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
Now, the second part of this chapter is 2.5 months later. So we go forward 2.5 months later, and now it's winter, and it's in December. And it tells us that we're at the Feast of Dedication. Now, we call the Feast of Dedication Hanukkah, and it's the Festival of Lights. And if you guys don't know what Hanukkah is or where it came from, it happened 164 before Christ, BC, and it's the celebration of this miraculous rededication and cleansing of the temple. Because what had happened is that the king of Assyria, Antiochus Epiphanes, he actually attacked Jerusalem, and he looted millions of dollars worth of gold and silver from the Jewish temple. And then he reigned in Jerusalem for 3 years. He had outlawed circumcision, and he crucified anybody who would practice it. And he turned the temple itself into a house of prostitution and set up the false god Zeus, and he set him up in the temple. And then he sacrificed pigs, which is unclean animal to Jews. And he would sacrifice pigs on the great altar in the temple. He had killed 80,000 Jews, and he had taken another 80,000 Jews, and he sold them into slavery. But there were these men, these rebels back then, and his name was Judas Maccabeus and his brothers. And they fought against the king of Syria, and they won. But when they went back into the temple to cleanse it, they were going to relight the 7-branch menorah that sat in the Holy of Holies. But they only had enough oil to keep it burning for 1 day. And so they used that oil, but miraculously that oil lasted for 8 days until they could make more oil so that the temple was actually cleansed and it was rededicated. Okay, so that's what Hanukkah is. And we read here that Jesus actually celebrated it. So it says Jesus is walking around Solomon's porch, which wasn't really built by Solomon. It was just named after him. And the Jewish leaders, they all gather around Jesus and they ambush him. Now, Jesus, he wasn't teaching and he wasn't healing anybody. He was doing absolutely nothing to offend them. He was just walking. And they gather around him, they force him in the middle of them, and he says, "How long will you keep us in doubt? Are you the Christ? Tell us plainly." But let's look back. Let's look back at what they've heard, what Jesus has told them by them. He's already told them, he goes, "I came from heaven." And he says, he who believes on me has eternal life. He told them, "I am the Son of God." He told them, "You judge the world." He told them, "You can't know the Father without me. I was sent by the Father." He said, "Before Abraham was, I am." He told them that he was the Son of Man. That was the prophecy in Daniel, and that he had the power to raise himself from the dead. And he used the name I am, the ego eimi, and he said, "I am," which is God, "the bread of life. I am the light of the world. I am the door, and I am the good shepherd." And so then he said, "I told you, you just don't believe." And then he tells him, and he says, well, look at the works again. Look at my works. He goes, "These are the works that I did in my Father's name." And Jesus then goes and he tells them why they don't believe him. And he says, you don't believe me, or you don't believe me because you're not my sheep. Then he tells them again, "My sheep hear me." And then he tells them benefits of being one of his sheep. And he says, if you were one of my sheep, no one could steal you away from me. And then Jesus identifies himself with his Father and says, "No one could steal you away or snatch you away from me." And he says, "And no one could ever snatch you out of my Father's hand." And then he says something that totally offends him. And he says, "My Father and I are one." Now, when Jesus says, "My Father and I are one," he's not saying that we're the same person. He's saying that they're the same essence. Just like if you were a father and you had a son, you're the same essence. You're both human. And so what he's saying is that they are both God. And even though they asked him and said, tell us plainly, well, he did tell them plainly. They didn't mean it. And so they picked up stones again to stone him. And you see, Jesus is never afraid of them. And so he just says to them, and he says, which of the works that I showed you are you going to stone me for? And with their own words, they acknowledge that Jesus did good works. And they said, not for good works, but for blasphemy. Now, if Jesus was lying about being God and his Father, then it would be blasphemy. And they did understand exactly what Jesus was saying. And the truth is, they got it exactly right. They said, you being man, make yourself God. And that's true. Jesus is fully man. He's also fully God. But the thing they got wrong is that he didn't make himself God. He was always God, and he always will be God. And so what you see here is you see Jesus is still reaching out to these men. He's reaching out to these Jewish leaders that are holding rocks in their hand, and he's pleading with them. But these men were so caught up in Jesus' words, the words that he was using, that they couldn't see that he was God, even after they asked him to speak plainly to him. And Jesus tells them, he says, don't get caught up in my words. And then he quotes from Psalm 82, verse 6. Now, if you read Psalm 82, and I'm not going to read that whole psalm, but if you read it, it tells these Jews how they should be treating people. And it tells them that they should be defending the poor and the fatherless, to do justice to the afflicted and the needy. And the part that he does quote, that Jesus does quote, he says, I said to you, you are gods. And if you read that psalm, you'll see that that whole psalm was actually written about these actual men. And the word there that's used for gods is the word that's used for God in creation. It's the Elohim, the same word in Genesis where it says, let us create man in our own image. And it's the same thing that's in the Shema that the Jews repeated every day. The Lord our God is one God. That's the same exact word for God, Elohim, which is a plural unity. It's a plural form of God. But the way that the Psalm 82 in verse 6 uses it, it's using it as judges. So God had called them judges, but he uses the word and he called them God. And even at the very end of that psalm, it says, we are all the children of God. And here's Jesus just calling himself a son of God, which is a child of God. So Jesus says that. He says, why are you calling it blasphemy when God calls you gods and I call myself son of God? And so then he pleads with them one more time. And he says, look at the works. Because he's asking them to look at those works so that they can believe in him. Because the reality is that these people who hate him, he wants them to believe. But you see, they have to see that he is in the Father and that the Father is also in him. Because there is no other way to be saved, not even for Jews. They have to believe in Jesus. And so now Jesus does this Jedi mind trick again, and he walks away from these men with stones in their hands. And I have this little picture in my mind. It's like, they have these stones, they're going to stone him, and he just walks through, but then they almost like try to start, but they kind of turn and they throw them at each other. That's how I picture it. But because he just walks right through these guys. They got stones in their hand, and he's done this now like 4 times. And so now this chapter ends, and Jesus goes back to where John was first baptizing, which was Bethabara, which is on the other side of the Jordan River, and it's in the area of Perea. And the reason that he went there is because the Jewish leaders have absolutely no authority there, because that area was ruled by Herod Antipas, the one who actually killed John the Baptist. And we're told that the people believed in Jesus there, and Jesus, we know, had never returned to Jerusalem until Palm Sunday, when he revealed himself as their Messiah, as their King. So here's the questions for today. Can you hear the voice? Can you hear his voice? Is he your shepherd? And our shepherd, he speaks not just to save us. He does speak so that we can be saved, but he also speaks to us so that we will follow him and that we can serve him, but we have to listen. There are many voices in this world, and they all compete for our attention. but you have to be still to listen for him, to hear him. You need to find pasture. You need to feed. You need to read your Bible. And then if you do these things, if you'll listen to him, you'll feed, you'll read his word, that he promises that he will give us abundant life. So here we are. We're back at the place where the eyewitnesses had snitched Jesus out. And we're told that the chief priests and the Pharisees together, that they called a council. And that council was the Sanhedrin. And Sanhedrin means the 70. It began back in Exodus with Moses when he appointed 70 people to help him judge Israel. And that was at the suggestion of his father-in-law, Jethro. Now, this council was made up of not only Sadducees, but Pharisees. And these two groups, they did not get along at all because they had different beliefs. The Sadducees, they were all priests. They had all descended from Aaron, and they ran the temple. And we remember that the temple was big business. The name Sadducees is derived from the name Zadok, which was the high priest during King David's reign. And their beliefs differed where they didn't believe in a resurrection, they didn't believe in spirits or angels, and the Pharisees, they believed in all these things. And although they could not get along, they could always get along when they went to fight a common enemy. And this time their enemy is Jesus. And so they say, what do we do? This man works many signs. If we leave him alone, everyone will believe in him. So this council, when they first opposed Jesus, it was because they did not believe he was the Messiah. And so they were checking it out, and that's why they opposed him. But now they're opposing him because they actually think he is the Messiah. And they testify the truth of the many signs he did. They just don't like him because he won't follow them. And then they're sitting around plotting, and they come to this logical conclusion that with anybody seeing all the signs that Jesus is doing, that everybody will believe in him. And so Caiaphas, it says, the high priest, well, he was a very, very wealthy man, and he was a very wicked man, and he was a very political man. And he was also descended from the high priest Aaron, the first priest. But these were very strange days in Israel, because back then there was actually two high priests, and there's not supposed to be. A high priest is appointed for life. But his father-in-law was the original high priest, but the Romans didn't like them. So they took him away, and they appointed Caiaphas to be the high priest. And so Caiaphas, he says, you know nothing at all, nor do you consider that it is expedient for us that one man should die for the people, that the whole nation should perish. Okay. Now, you have to understand, the Sadducees, they also had a reputation among themselves that they were rude. They were rude. They even thought they were rude, and they thought other Sadducees were rude. And the thing is that God had honored not this man, because this is a prophecy, and it was spoken from the high priest, but God is not honoring the man. He's honoring the office of high priest. And John goes on to explain, and what John has said in his gospel many times, it's not only for Israel, but that it was for us, for the children of God that were scattered abroad. Like we talked about before, he has that other fold of sheep, which is us. And so the Sanhedrin, they come to their official answer, and their official answer is, we need to murder the Messiah. And they told us why. And what they said is because they didn't want the Romans to come and take away their place. Now, what they considered their place, they considered the temple their place, because they made millions from it. Because they did it by gouging the people that actually came to worship. And even though they hated Rome, they hated Jesus more, and they would rather serve Rome than Jesus. But the truth is, it wasn't their place. This was Jesus' temple, as he told us, and he called it his Father's house. And what these leaders feared the most of the Romans coming and taking their place, it actually happened. And the Romans did come and take their place. And that was in 70 AD when they destroyed Jerusalem and they destroyed the temple, where no stone was not overturned. And all the Jews were either murdered or sold into slavery or exiled. And all these things had happened actually before this gospel was even written, because this gospel was written in 90 AD, and the destruction of Jerusalem was actually in 70 AD. And so now these guys are sitting around, and all they're thinking about is, how do we kill him? But Jesus knew what they were planning, so he actually left with his disciples, and he went 15 miles north of Jerusalem to a town called Ephraim. And Ephraim was up there in the area of Samaria, and that actual town had switched back and forth between the Samaritans and the tribe of Benjamin for years and years and years. And we're told here, what we read today, that the Passover was near, so it was coming up, and the pilgrims were starting to arrive in Jerusalem. Because we know that, according to the law, that if you were a Jew, you had to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem if you could. And if you could and you didn't, you were cut off from your people. And so there's a lot of people flooding the streets, and they're coming, and they're taking times to travel. And we have in history a man named Josephus, who was a Jew, who was a historian during this period of time. And in his writings, they had taken a census of how many lambs that were actually sacrificed for the Passover meal. And the count was 256,500 lambs. Now, if you figured roughly 4 people per lamb, which I would think is very minimal, that's very conservative, you have way over 2 million people in Jerusalem during the Passover. So now you have these Pharisees and Sadducees, and they're hanging out around the temple because they're looking for Jesus, and they're wondering, is he going to come? And then they put out this official order, and it's, if anyone knows where Jesus is, you have to report it, because they're going to arrest him. So now we start in chapter 12, and we know that Jesus has less than a week before he's crucified. And the Gospel of John is not like the other synoptic Gospels, the other 3 Gospels. And about 50% of what John writes is all concentrated and spoken in this last week of Jesus' ministry on earth. And John gives us a more intimate insight than of the conversation and all the details between him and his disciples that are found in any of the other 3 Gospels. So we're told it's 6 days before the Passover, and Jesus and his disciples, they're invited to a dinner at Martha's, and it's to honor Jesus. They wanted to pay him back and show their love for him for what they did for his brother. And Jesus, again, he's not afraid of the Jews, and so he heads to Bethany in Judea, and that's even knowing that he's a wanted man. Because what Jesus wants to do is he wants to spend this last week with his friends, because he knows his time is short. So he'd rather go and have a quiet dinner with the people he loves. And we know from the other Gospels, because this is written also in Matthew and it's also written in Mark, that this meal was held at the house of Simon the leper. And we do know that Jesus had to have healed him at one point, because Jesus is the only one who had ever healed lepers. And if he was still currently a leper, he would have to live outside of the city, and he wouldn't even be allowed to live in his own home. And many people think that this Simon was actually Martha's husband. I don't know why they thought that, but they thought that would be a good story, I guess. And so now we have Martha, and she's serving again, but this time she's not complaining about Mary not helping her, because she's Martha Stewart, and she's a very good hostess. And there's absolutely nothing that she wouldn't do for Jesus because Jesus brought her brother back. And so now you have this scene, and Lazarus, he's reclining at the table, and there's Jesus and the disciples, and they're all sitting around, and they're probably laughing, and they're laughing about how silly Lazarus looked waddling out of that tomb and tripping all over himself. And they're having this great meal, and in the middle of the dinner, we're told in Matthew's gospel that Mary, she takes this alabaster flask, and it's filled with a pound of spikenard. And so she breaks the top of this flask, because these you had to break the top of. And it was the only way to get the oil out of it. And this is a one-time use type of flask. And in our gospel, it says that she anointed his feet. But in Matthew's gospel, it also says that she poured this on his head. And so she poured the whole thing out. And so after she pours this on Jesus' head, she moves toward his feet. And she takes down her hair. A Jewish woman would never take down her hair in public. But she's humbling herself. She doesn't care what people think. So in this act of worship of Mary's, what she's doing is she's taking the position of a slave, because to wash a guest's feet was the position of the lowest slave in the household. We see this again at the Last Supper when Jesus takes the position of a slave and he washes the disciples' feet. And so now she starts to anoint his feet with the perfume, and she wipes his feet with her hair, because there's nothing too good for her Lord. And you see, she's made herself a slave, and this is what you'd call a bond slave. It's by her own choice. She made herself a slave because of her love for him. And so now this home is not only filled with the presence of Jesus, but it's filled with this beautiful fragrance. And they're all sitting there, and they're all able to enjoy this, the beauty of this moment. And then during this beautiful moment, Judas speaks. And these are the first words we ever hear of Judas in the Gospels. And what he says is, "Why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" Judas had a good eye for value. 300 denarii was equal to 1 year's wage, and a small alabaster jar of oil, they were often used for investments because they were small and they were portable and they were very, very valuable. And some of you know, you buy essential oils, and I know some of you know how expensive some of those oils are, and it was the same back then. But we're told here that Judas, he didn't really care for the poor, but he was a thief.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,